Hi, and welcome back to On the Right Side of History with Kansans for Life. I'm Danielle Underwood, your host. Today, we are diving into a groundbreaking new study from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. It's raising serious concerns about the significant health risks of chemical abortion pills and whether this information may have been kept from the American public. We're joined today by Alexandra DeSanctis, a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a regular contributing writer at National Review. She's also co-author with Ryan T. Anderson of the 2022 book, Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. Welcome, Alexandra, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you wrote this article, which appeared in National Review on April 28th. The same day that this study was released. And the headline for your story is Chemical Abortion Far More Dangerous to Women Than FDA Admits, Research Shows. And before we really dig into details, and there are so many details in this research, I'm wondering if we could just start with a top-line takeaway from the story so you can kind of put everything into a beginning context for us before we unpack it.
Sure. So my article was really helping to publicize a research paper that we published, my colleagues published at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, digging into an all-payer claims database and finding that, tracking more than 865,000 prescribed chemical abortions, that the rate of serious adverse events for women after taking chemical abortion drugs is far higher than the FDA discloses. So when women are prescribed chemical abortions, they believe there's a certain chance of serious risks, serious side effects to themselves. And according to the research we've done, in fact, that rate of risk is actually much higher.
So this study, when you say all-payer database, I think that's really helpful to understand the differences between the data sets that have been looked at in the past and why this is so different. If I'm understanding right from what I've read about the study, it was really looking at insurance data, insurance claims that followed the prescribing of these abortion chemicals. Is that right? Can we talk about that piece of this?
That's right. So this information is coming from claims, and so we can track one specific woman through the prescription of a chemical abortion all the way through other claims that she made. So if she ended up going to the emergency room and had severe hemorrhaging, for example, or sepsis, or had a follow-up surgical abortion, for example, we can kind of track the data, can track that information all the way through versus the clinical trial. So when the FDA says there's a 0.5% chance of serious side effects after a chemical abortion for a woman, they're relying on much older data, and they're relying on clinical trials, which is a very different type of setting from when women actually take the chemical abortion drug.
And I think it's really important too to realize that women are literally told, at least what we've been told from former workers in abortion facilities, that after they're given these abortion chemicals, they're often told that if they needed to go to an emergency room, they would just simply tell the workers at that emergency room that they were actually having a miscarriage. They were experiencing a miscarriage. So they're intentionally told to tell an untruth when they arrive at that emergency room. So really the study is taking that piece out of this, and it is it's like clicking two pieces of a puzzle together to be able to tell that full picture. Is that right?
No, that's exactly right. And that's a really important point that you raise. And I think a really big piece of what we need to talk about here is how, sort of like I said, women don't know what they're getting into when they take chemical abortion drugs. But on top of that, oftentimes they're not even getting follow-up care properly if they're going in and not admitting to having taken chemical abortion drugs. Their follow-up care is probably not going to be as effective as it could be if they were telling the full story. And I think part of why there used to be stronger safety regulations around these drugs, and we can probably talk about that more, I imagine, but there used to be stronger safety regulations in terms of the prescription of these drugs, and the doctor was required to follow along with a woman, to be there in person at first, and then to be part of follow-up care if follow-up care was needed. That piece has been taken out of this now because abortion supporters are really trying to make it as loose as possible for women to just get these drugs via telemedicine, via the mail. And so now it's actually a lot harder for any doctor to know what happens after a woman takes these drugs at home.
Yeah, and I definitely want to dig into that conversation here in just a second. I think we should kind of give some more of the details of the study, and then we can start unpacking that piece of it as well. So, this is the largest known study of the abortion pill's after effects. It's 28 times larger than the FDA, the clinical trials, which I believe you already mentioned. And I think it's really important that that real world data is in place in this study. So if we were going to be talking about what were those implications, how many women are truly actually seeing complications from the abortion pills?
So in terms of this data, this surveyed 865,000 insurance claims, like I mentioned. So that's 865,000 women following through from getting the prescription of the chemical abortion drug all the way through any serious side effects they experienced later on. And our research found that close to 11% of women, so more than 1 in 10 women, experience at least one kind of serious adverse event after taking this drug. So 1 in 10 women versus the alleged 0.5% that the FDA discloses on the drug label for mifepristone.
That's a lot of women. Considering that the abortion pill has become the most common method of abortions being performed in the United States now. And just because not all of our listeners are from Kansas, but the predominant amount of listeners for our program are here in Kansas. So I wanted to just put that into Kansas terms for people for just a second. So our most recent state data was from 2023, and we received those in December, those numbers. We had 19,467 abortions performed in Kansas. And out of those, 67% were chemical abortion pills. So just doing the math here, that means that over 13,000 women were given these chemical abortion pills. So applying the research to this and those complication rates, that means that over 1,300 women just in our state in just 1 year actually most likely had those complications happen. And that to me is staggering to think about all the women who have been suffering and very possibly, in silence or, in some kind of, told that they needed to keep it quiet, what the cause of that suffering was, and ended up having to go seek emergency care. So that's a lot of women. And we're seeing this all across the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right to point to that data. And my understanding is at the national level, about 2/3, so similar to Kansas, about 2/3 of all abortions in the country take place via chemical abortion now. And a lot of times, if you kind of take a look at anecdotes of women saying, well, I got this drug and I was told, it would be nothing more than, maybe a slightly heavier period. That's what you would experience. And in fact, 1 in 10 women now are experiencing things like sepsis, serious infection, serious hemorrhaging, not at all what they're being told. And again, because they don't see a doctor in person, they probably don't really have much sense of what to do for follow-up care. These women might be at home thinking, well, is this normal? Is this not? What am I supposed to do? And, adding to the trauma of having self-administered an abortion.
Yeah, and I think trauma is the right word for it. Just the reports we hear from women and what that experience is truly like for them. It is traumatic. So when we talk about sepsis and infection, I think not everyone has familiarity with those words. Can you describe what sepsis would be like if you encountered that?
So my understanding is this has to do with potentially incomplete abortions, or if not the entire baby is able to pass out as a result of taking the drugs, or there's just some kind of serious inflammation or infection or kind of worsening of whatever. The drugs work by targeting the baby, removing nutrients from the baby. So that's the first drug, mifepristone, and then the second drug, misoprostol, that's prescribed, is supposed to kind of expel the baby and whatever else, all the other tissues involved in pregnancy. And so if that process doesn't happen completely, a woman could end up with a serious infection or, fever, all the other things that go along with some kind of essentially serious infection, I would say.
And that's not even thinking about the risk of ectopic pregnancy, which we know is another potential. Do you want to add anything about ectopic pregnancy risk?
Sure. Yeah. So one serious problem with the telemedicine prescription of chemical abortions is that if a woman has an unknown ectopic pregnancy or her pregnancy is further along than she's aware, and she doesn't go to see anybody in person before taking chemical abortion drugs, that's exceptionally dangerous for her. Now, there's always risks that go along with chemical abortion drugs, regardless. But so in an ectopic pregnancy, if the baby's actually implanted in the fallopian tube or somewhere else outside the uterus, that could lead to, uterine or rupture of the fallopian tube. If the baby's older than she knows, that could lead to more serious complications. And there's really no way to know if that's happening without seeing a doctor in person.
And we know that there are also risks when a woman doesn't know the true number of weeks in gestation that she might be in her pregnancy. That's another very common issue, especially as you mentioned with these mail order, with the push to move these chemicals into a mail order process. And, she may not even be seen in person by a doctor. In our state, we no longer have an in-person doctor requirement. And that's because of our state Supreme Court's rulings on the previously existing laws that we had here. They have deemed that to be unconstitutional. And so women are no longer protected even by that very thin layer of protection. So I think we're going to go back then to what you were saying about the changes that have happened within the FDA process. And really my question is, how have these risks stayed hidden for so long?
I think a big part of the problem is the FDA really has not relied on serious research, from what we can tell, or at least it's not as up to date. It's not as large of a research study as what this research paper shows, and so the FDA data just suggests that 0.5% of women might experience serious side effects, and they haven't really looked at it more closely than that. Which is very unfortunate because at the same time that these risks are out there, these risks are greater than the FDA admits. They've been under the Obama and Biden administrations loosening safety requirements. And so I think it's simply a matter of when it comes to abortion, the idea that women's health is at risk is not something that anybody who supports legal abortion wants to take seriously. They fear that that will lead to, perhaps greater safety regulations for women. But that also translates into less access to abortion, because oftentimes greater access, looser access to abortion is dangerous for women. That's really the truth of the matter.
Truly. And also, unfortunately, it's more profitable, right? If it's much more easier for them to prescribe these chemicals to women. So we also know, as we're discussing here, that pro-abortion activists have really downplayed the previously known risks, even those previously known risks, which were already identified, just downplayed. They have been working hard to label chemical abortions as what they call self-managed abortions. And they have tried to associate them with the words easy, safe, common, all of those things being at the expense of women's true health and safety. And even as those regulations that were surrounding them have become far less careful. So what does this tell us about the larger context of this debate?
Well, I think what we're dealing with is a situation where, the very, let's say, aggressive supporters of abortion, kind of like I mentioned, are frightened that any regulations at all, even if they're aimed at the health and safety of women, are going to put roadblocks up in front of abortion, because women's health and safety is not compatible with abortion at all, I would say, but certainly not with, total unfettered access to the point where you're not seeing a doctor in person, you're maybe not seeing a doctor at all, you're receiving these drugs via mail and taking them at home. That's obviously not compatible with women's health and safety. And I think most people don't know that. Most women, even people who might generally support abortion or might in certain circumstances consider abortion, they're not aware of that context. And they're really being put at risk. And if you Google chemical abortion, the first few things that come up are, as you pointed out, fast, easy, safe, right to your door. And it sounds like this easy reset button when you find out you're pregnant and don't want to be. And in reality, of course, we all know what abortion is. And so that's a horrible thing that we should also dive into. But on top of that, there's a significant risk to women's health that they're not aware of because it looks like this simple, quick, medical drug that you take and it's fine for you. It just gets rid of the consequences of your actions and it's all over. And in fact, you're actually putting yourself at serious risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was just on several different websites just preparing for this conversation and looking at the way that it is presented through some medical associations, certainly through some abortion facility, some abortion providers, and they were saying that these complications were extremely rare, with quotes around that, extremely rare. So it is going to be interesting as we see, first of all, if this can truly break into the mainstream. This is very important information to get to the American public, and how they're going to address that on all of these, just probably hundreds and thousands of websites that are right now saying that the complications are extremely rare. So we're going to have to see what happens. Even before all of this has come out, we know that the people's trust in the Food and Drug Administration has been falling. One recent poll that I found by KFF, which was formerly the Kaiser Family Foundation, says that they found a 10% decline in the number of Americans who say they trust the agency just since 2023. So in a year and a half, that trust rate fell over 10%. And then among Republicans, the fall was even more pronounced. There was only 39% of Republicans reported that they have a fair amount or a great deal of trust in the FDA in 2025. So that's a 13% drop in that time period. So we know that they've got some public trust to regain. This is certainly going to potentially compound that problem. So as you mentioned, the Obama and Biden administrations, having a role in the loosening of these restrictions, we need to think about, what do you think what steps does the Trump administration need to direct the FDA to do to address the situation now?
Well, I think it's imperative that the FDA try to replicate the research that we have in this paper. And, I think it's very solid research. Of course, I think we did a great job on it. Our team did a great job, but they can replicate it, right? The FDA can and must try to determine whether or not this is true. Is the complication rate, the serious, adverse event rate, 22 times higher than the one they report, as we found. And if it is, they absolutely have to take steps to pull the abortion pill from the market because it's not safe. And, if Tylenol had a 1 in 10 risk of serious adverse events to everybody who took it, do you think that would still be available to the American public? Certainly not, right? And so, my fear is that because this is about abortion, it's going to be touched by, as Justice Scalia called it, the abortion distortion, and this won't be dealt with fairly. But I think the Trump administration and even the director of the FDA, he specifically indicated an openness to revisit this issue if different data, were available. And now there's an indication that the data is indeed quite different. So my hope is that they will follow through on really digging into this and doing what needs to be done.
That's an excellent point. And we know that gold standard science replication of studies is part of the scientific process. So I think what you're calling for is so warranted. It makes sense that would need to happen, and that a great deal more caution needs to be put into place to protect women from the dangers that are right here in front of us and maybe have been hiding in plain sight. So just outside of the science itself, you're obviously doing everything you can to bring this to the forefront of the American discussion. And we know that it needs to have a lot more coverage. So I'm wondering, what else do you think we can do now to bring more attention and awareness to this problem?
Well, I think it's something probably that in the context of Kansas, people could contact their state lawmakers about and share the data to the extent that it's relevant to the legislative process in your state. But I also think all Americans can and should contact the FDA and urge them to, like I said, replicate the studies, figure out what is actually true about the abortion pill, and to regulate it appropriately, at the very least, to put the old health and safety regulations back in place for women. But ideally, to pull the abortion pill altogether.
That's an excellent point. Do you happen to know if the FDA has a process that they have put in place to hear that kind of feedback from the American public?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that the eppc.org website, where we published our paper, will give some instructions for listeners.
So, Alexandra, where would be a good place for people to go to be able to see the specifics of the study and to really get the full picture in their minds? Where can they go find that?
So the full study is available on eppc.org. The paper's there, and you can dig into the research. And listeners can also go to stopharmingwomen.org, which gives more details, and you can take action by contacting the FDA through that website.
Great, great, great. And then where do you recommend people follow you and so they can stay up to date with your work and future EPPC findings?
So I have my own scholar page at eppc.org as well, just under my name. And then I'm also somewhat active on Twitter, so you can follow me there at Zan_DeSanctis. Great.
We will share that as well. Anything that you have coming up in the near future that you're able to share yet that follows this?
Well, I'll just be doing more interviews to try and share the research with as many people as possible, and possibly writing more about it down the road as this unfolds. Hopefully the FDA will be taking action, and I'll be tracking that as things continue to unfold.
Yeah, well, I can only imagine how many angles you could unpack this from, how many stories are really within this research. There are so many important things that it brings to the surface, and let's just hope and pray that it goes absolutely viral, that people understand how huge this is for the American public to have this kind of information revealed to us, and that and I love your idea about putting pressure on the Food and Drug Administration to follow through with that science that needs to occur, and really looking at that protocol again and seeing if we can remedy that problem. So, anything else you would like to share with us before we wrap up today?
Well, I would just say I think this is a really important data, certainly, and I appreciate the chance to dig into it. But I also think listeners should know, even if you're on the fence about abortion, or people who are on the fence about abortion, this is also ultimately about women's health. And pro-lifers have always said that abortion has two victims, right? The unborn child and the pregnant mother. And I think this data really, really bears out that second story, that it's not just the unborn child who's at risk. Women really are too.
Yes, 100%. You are so right. Well, thank you, Alexandra. We appreciate your time today. We appreciate your voice on that public stage, and you sharing this. You sharing your. You just have done such a masterful job of unpacking it for us and for really highlighting the most important pieces of this. And we look forward to seeing more from you in the future.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
And thank you to all of you who joined us for this conversation today. Before you go, I need to ask a quick favor. Whichever platform you're watching on or listening on today, please hit like or give us a 5-star review to help boost us in the search algorithm to reach more listeners. If you learned something valuable from this conversation, take 2 minutes and share this with a friend or leave us a comment. We love hearing your thoughts about KFL's podcast. Lastly, please remember that you can support our efforts when you purchase 7 Weeks Coffee through the link on our website at kfl.org. Until next time, never forget, the pro-life movement is on the right side of history. Stay strong. The truth will overcome. Thanks, friends, and we will see you soon.